All right, everybody, let's get right into it. And so I'm going to take you through this letterpress job from start to finish. So we've already gone through the design in the previous videos, and now we're going to be looking into all of the process that takes place in the shop. So the very first thing, and probably one of the most important things, is cutting down your paper. A lot of printers actually don't really cut the sheets down until afterwards, but I prefer to do it before because it saves paper and I'm able to get like a perfect lineup based on that sheet. I've had issues before where I had like a very critical border element in the early days, and then I went to trim it after and I ruined enough of them that I had to put the plates back on press and reprint. So I find this eliminates a variable right from the beginning. If there's any sort of ragged pieces or sheets that get a little bit torn, I'm able to eliminate those before I even get on press. Now I want to mention that this stack cutter is not the best stack cutter. The main issue I tend to have with it is blade creep. When I actually put my stack of paper into the press and cut it, I find that sometimes the blade or the pressure of it pulling draws the stack a little bit, which causes the cuts to come out not 100% precise, and that's definitely an issue when you're working with letterpress. So if you can afford it, I would definitely recommend getting a better stack cutter or one with a wheel tightening method. You can see in a second here, I'm going to pull down a bar, and that's what holds the paper in place. Using a wheel, you're able to get it a lot tighter and eliminate some of that blade creep. Now for some jobs, you may actually have to cut your sheets bigger than the final trim size, but even with many images that are full bleed on one or two sides, sometimes even three sides, I don't really have any major issues. As long as there's room for the pins to hold the paper without hitting the plate, you should be able to cut your paper to final size before printing. Ultimately, the main issue is to just measure twice and cut once. If you take your time and you're very careful with whatever machine you do have, you shouldn't really have any major issues. Mixing ink is probably one of the most important steps before you get on press. So in addition to cutting, which is also important, mixing your colors is going to be the first thing that people notice when they receive their prints. So it's essential that you're accurate. Even when my clients don't specify a Pantone number, I always use my Pantone book when I'm mixing my colors. It helps me get a really accurate color, and I'm also able to use it to match to specific items like these envelopes. Once I've selected the Pantone color I'm going to use, I go to my ink selection and I choose the mixing colors that are required to make that color. Now in this shop, we use oil-based inks, and there's two main differences between the oil-based and the rubber-based inks that are often used in letterpress. Both are actually oil-based, but the oil-based inks that are called oil-based in name will actually form a skin on the top, and so you have to kind of dig gently underneath it to get to the good ink. Now, the rubber-based inks don't form this skin, but they have a different disadvantage, and that's that they don't dry by evaporation. Oil-based inks will dry or cure better on a variety of surfaces that rubber-based inks will not. Now for this navy, I believe I'm using reflex blue and black. There's a couple of different blacks you can get. There's actually mixing blacks and then sort of a pure dark black. I chose to just get the pure dark black. I don't find it's a major issue when I'm mixing my colors. In the same note, I don't like to use transparent white when I'm mixing my colors either. Some people believe the opaque white gives a little bit of a cool cast to the colors, but I've never had an issue with getting a beautiful match using the opaque white. If you find you do need an absolutely perfect match, for example, if you're matching someone's branding and you're having trouble mixing it yourself, you can order Pantone colors for about $65 a can, or you can actually weigh your colors out on a scale. So you can set a little tray on like an ounce scale, and often the Pantone guide will tell you the parts so that you can say 5 parts white, 10 parts black. You could weigh those out by weight and mix the color that way and ensure a really, really good match. I've never really had to do that, and I've never had a client that felt so concerned with the color match that they wanted to pay for the 5 pound or the 1 pound can of ink in the custom color. But if you're going to do work maybe more than once, I can be a really good idea. For example, I have a shop color, a Pantone color that's called Tiger Lily that I use for any of the branding items in shop. This means that I don't have to remix that over and over again, and I'm able to get a perfect match every single time that I print an item that has Panthera Press on it. Now you might notice that this is a very long segment to this video, and I've talked a little bit about ink, but the last thing that I want to mention is the actual physical mixing. And that is, I mean, everybody does it differently. You can see I sort of just try and rotate the blade and scrape it up and bring it back to center. Ultimately, mix it however you want, but make sure that you mix it really, really well. So it may take a minute or two for the ink to kind of warm up and get, a little more smooth. But while you're doing that, just keep working the ink and drawing it back in towards the center so that you don't end up having the color shift as you add more ink on press. Finally, the last thing you need to do is actually check your ink match. So there's a couple ways to do this. Some people take their finger and tap it out on a sheet of paper. Some people like to draw it out on a card, which is what I'm going to do here. Generally, I trust my ink color enough after I've mixed it to my Pantone guide that I'm ready to put it right on press. After you're happy with your ink, you're ready to move on to the next step, which is lineup. Getting your plates and your paper lined up on press, I've found, is one of the biggest learning curves in letterpress. I think that my method for doing this with platen presses is one of the easiest ways to get started. So what I do is I find an area in the plates when I'm designing them, and I put registration marks in a blank spot. Then all I need to do is get the plate lined up facing the piece of paper, add some tape to a negative space, and stick it right onto the card. So here I am, and I'm actually just checking or adjusting my packing here. I always use a piece of acetate as my top sheet because it's super easy to clean, and it means that I rarely have to replace any of my Timpin. It's really expensive, and I don't like to damage it. After I've done that, all I need to do is seat my piece of paper into my gauge pins. And now in this case, they didn't really need to be moved. So I'm just kind of dropping this RSVP card into those, removing the sticky backing, and then I'm going to set the press to print, roll it forward, and it's going to deposit that plate right onto my boxcar base. All you need to be careful about is making sure that your pins, the little part that's holding the paper, is between the plate and the paper so that it doesn't get pulled off your top sheet when it goes onto the base. So after I've locked my chase in, I usually just sort of hand roll this forward. I don't want to turn on the press and then have any issues, but this tends to be a really easy and accurate way to get your prints lined up with your sheet. I don't find that I usually have to make a lot of adjustments to the pins afterwards. Now, one thing I like to do is actually reach in and grab the sheet as I'm backing up, and that just prevents the sheet from pulling the pins off the top sheet when the tape kind of comes loose. Alright, so the next step is putting the rollers on the press. And you may notice that there's some tape on my rails. I like to use strapping tape to kind of adjust the roller height because it's really easy to remove, it doesn't compress a lot over time, and it stays true over a long period of time. I actually adjusted the rail height about 2.5, 3 years ago, and I haven't had to mess with it since. Now, some people like to only use 2 rollers. I prefer to use all 3 because it means they wear evenly, and I think that maybe it's just a personal thing, but it gives the nicest, most even ink coverage on my plates. I tend to print a little large for this press, and so having the extra roller helps keep the ink better distributed. When you go to actually add your ink, just know that you really don't need a lot. A pea-size amount, like literally just one little green pea, is all you're really going to need unless you have a very large image area. Just make sure your chase is removed so it doesn't get gunked up with ink, but after you've added your little bit of ink, start up the press and let it roll out until you have a nice even coverage of ink. After you've got your ink nice and even on press, you can stop your press and put your chase in. Now I've gotten really good at learning to stop the press at just the right time, but make sure your rollers are not in the way and are going to kind of hit the base when you go to put your chase in. And now it's time to take our first print. So I'm actually pulling the wheel back here, and then I'm going to start the press and take my first proof. Now there's a sharp little cut there because my belt actually flew off and I had to put it back on. But once you're ready and you've let the plate ink up once or twice, you can pull it into print mode, take a print, throw it back into trip, and check your accuracy. So once again, I'm looking for the coverage of the ink, and I want to see kind of like how heavy it is. Are there any areas on the plates that are not printing properly? Do I need to add any packing to one side or the other side? And I'm kind of gauging all of that information. Now what I saw here was that I had a little bit too much ink, and so I'm going to stop my press, take my chase out, and I'm going to remove a little bit of ink. Now your first thought may be to get a mineral spirit soaked rag, and I don't recommend that. I actually like to use a dry rag because the mineral spirits or whatever you're using to clean the press at the end can contaminate the ink a little bit and kind of make it print off. It can make it sort of slimy or kind of not stick to the plate. So in this case, I'm just going to take a dry rag and rub off what looks like a significant amount of ink, but it's really not that much. This is also your opportunity to make sure that your ink is accurate. If your ink is not right at this stage or the color is not true, you need to take it back off and remix. Once you've confirmed that everything about your print is right, the color, the placement, the ink coverage, the spacing, all of that, you can go and remove your registration marks. Now in this case, I actually don't take the chase out, and the reason for that is sometimes the chase doesn't sit in the press exactly the same way, and if I were to remove it and put it back in, there's a potential that it could shift. Now the key here is just to make sure that you always cut away from your image area. Trust me, I learned that one from experience. Finally, we're at the most exciting part of the process, which is the actual print process. So now that we know that our ink coverage is accurate, our color is right, and our lineup is good, we just need to work on feeding the press. Now my press is motorized, but I actually have it on the slowest setting. Now for a beginner, this might be a little bit quick, but I find keeping it at the slowest setting means that I can take the time to feed accurately. I like to stop every couple of prints or so and check and make sure that nothing has changed, that my ink coverage is still good, and that my prints are still coming out perfectly. Because I like to feed relatively slow, I actually keep my ink coverage a little bit on the thinner side. This means between every 5 to 10 prints, I need to let the press ink up twice. So once I have it adjusted, I'm ready to go and I want to start counting. I just need to reset my counter. So what I do is I roll all the dials to 9, and then on the next print it will roll over to 0 and start counting my prints. So here we can kind of look at the feeding process from a little bit of a different angle. Now most people will just use one hand to feed. I actually use two. I don't know if that's a bad habit or not. My press goes slow enough that I don't find this is a big issue. It's really important that you just make sure your hands are out of the jaws of the press the second it starts to move towards the base. Never chase a print that has slipped or fallen. It's better to have one inaccurate print that you have to throw out than to lose your fingers. Now another reason that I end up kind of having to use two hands is my acetate top sheet is a little bit staticky, so the paper sometimes seems to stick a little bit. I can feed with just the one right hand and then pull out with the left hand, but I think this is just sort of like my comfortable way of feeding. You're going to have to learn whatever really works for you and what you're most comfortable with. When I'm teaching people to do this, I don't even give them any paper. I just try and get them into the rhythm of putting one hand in, taking that hand out, putting the next hand in, and taking that hand out in the same way that you would place your paper in, take a print, and then pull the sheet out. And once you get into the rhythm, this is actually the fastest part of the letterpress process. Lastly, a little tip I find really helpful is to take your first perfect print and keep it on your feed board where you can see it. This allows you to compare subsequent prints and make sure that you add ink when your ink starts to get light. It also helps you catch any minor errors like areas filling in or knocking off the plate. All right, so we're on to the second color. Now, in most cases, I would actually print the lighter color first, but because the dark plate was the most important to get accurate on the sheet, I printed that as sort of the key block or the key plate, and now I'm actually going to move on to the lighter plate. So because I'm moving to a lighter color so soon after printing a dark color, I need to run a cleaning cycle on press. So I've cleaned off all of the ink from the rollers and the inking plate, and I've added a product called Easy Street, and this is a awesome roller cleaning product. So anytime you need to print white or yellow or a really light color, I recommend that you run a cycle of this on your press. So here I'm just kind of moving it around. It's sort of a little bit oily and kind of hard sometimes to get it to the edges of the roller. So I'm just kind of like wiping it across the rollers so that it will spread out and properly clean both my rollers and my inking plate. After you've let that run for just a couple of minutes, you simply take the rollers off press and then re-clean really well with mineral spirits, both your rollers and your ink disc. So now we're back to that sort of challenging lineup part of the process, except this time we have to make sure to line up our second color so that we have perfect registration with our first color. Now the lineup is pretty much the same in that I'm going to be using some tape to hold the plate onto the paper and then depositing it onto press by putting it in the pins, peeling off the sticky backing, and rolling the press forward. The only difference is that this is where the registration pins really come in handy. So these registration marks can actually seat into the registration marks from the first color run. If you take a couple prints with a little bit of a deeper impression, you can really feel the registration marks kind of sit into where the other ones were printed. And this will quickly get you to an almost perfect lineup. Alright, so my press is clean, I ran my Easy Street, and now I have nice dry clean rollers, and it's time to add some ink. Now you can definitely see here there's a really thick skin on this ink. It's an older ink, so I think it might be like 10 or 15 years old. I actually bought it secondhand, but it's definitely a testament to how long these inks really last. I've come back to ink like a year or two later that was just wrapped in a foil packet, and it was still good to print with. So make sure that you invest in getting the inks you really need for your shop. I purchased an entire Pantone mixing set, and I really recommend that. Okay, so now we're back to getting our orange plate on press and kind of getting it lined up. Now I've printed some other pieces in between printing the first color of this and this second color, so I have to adjust my pins. And I use compressible gauge pins. You can actually purchase these online, but I simply make mine with spare bits of photopolymer and some foam tape. Now, what's so great about these pins is they won't damage the base, so it allows me to use a much larger boxcar base in my press. The other advantage is that they're really easy to move around. I don't have to cut a slot into my top sheet to fit my pins. So you'll see as I'm kind of making the adjustments here that all I really need to do is sort of unstick them, scoot them around, and kind of find the right placement. As I'm adjusting these pins for this sort of first lineup, something I'm keeping in mind is that I want the piece of paper to be as close to the center of the tympan as possible. And the reason is that the pressure is greatest in the center and it's kind of more uneven towards the edges. Making sure that your prints are as close to center as possible will ensure you get the most even prints. Now this next stage is kind of a little bit boring. It's really just watching me make these adjustments. But something I want you to kind of keep an eye on is that these adjustments that I'm going to make are really, really, really small. And getting in the mindset to make these adjustments, I think, was the hardest thing for me to learn. When I was first printing, I would kind of start trying to make an adjustment, I would over adjust, then the print would have shifted all the way over one way, and it was so frustrating to have to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. As you're kind of getting into this, a kind of visual I liked to use was to imagine that the print that you're taking is projected onto the paper and you have to scoot the paper underneath it. This will kind of help you get into the mindset of sort of moving the paper left to scoot the actual print right. So it can be a little bit counterintuitive when you're first starting to make those adjustments, and that's why getting that first line up by taping the plate to the paper is so helpful. Additionally, making sure that you take enough prints with the registration marks on them before you cut them off can also be a big help. One of the reasons I actually use the registration mark circles with the crossbars instead of using crop marks on all four edges is because I think this really helps me get a sense of if the plate is slightly rotated incorrectly. It's just the way that kind of makes the most sense to me. If you're first starting out and you really kind of want to use the crop marks on all four edges, it's a great way to start. It does help make sure that your prints are exactly where they're supposed to be on the page because you can use the crop marks to trim after you've taken your prints. In my case, because I do the trimming before, it's not as important. I just make sure when I take my first prints that I measure and that they're correct, and then I don't really have to worry about it. So it almost looks like I'm frozen in time here for a second, and the reason is I usually really have to think before I make a move. I don't want to scoot the pin and throw the whole thing out of alignment, so I'm usually kind of doing that visual of the transparency and kind of thinking about it very carefully. It gets easier with experience and ultimately only takes me maybe 5 or 6 prints to get those crop marks perfectly lined up. So I want to point out a key mistake that I made early on, and that's when lining up your second colors, you really have to pay attention when you did the first color to how you fed the print into the press. Now I used a little red arrow to remind me when I was lining up the second color, but you have to make sure that you're always feeding the paper the same way or you risk having your prints misalign because of any minor cutting areas, or cutting errors I should say, in the sheet itself. Essentially, if you always feed the same way on every color, you're going to have more accurate prints. So here I am cutting off the registration marks again, and I was able to take the chase out this time because this print had a little bit less of a hairline registration. It wasn't a major issue, and I thought that this would be easier for you guys to see kind of how I do this. So this cuts through really easily. Just go slow and always cut away from your image. At some point in your print career, there's going to be a time where you have to line something up without having the registration marks. And I think my method of taping the print down onto the page still works even without registration marks. In this case, I'm actually printing thank you cards using the RSVP plates and then adding a different text plate. And this was a great way to reuse the plates so that I didn't have to order an additional plate and I was able to keep the design consistent across the entire suite. And finally, we're at the most boring part of the whole print process, and that's the cleanup. So here you can see I'm making an ink taco. At least that's what we called them in the print shop in MCAD. They were called tacos. I don't know if there's another word for this, but I always save any extra ink in a foil packet. And you can see this is actually most of the ink that I mixed up. You really don't need a lot of ink on press, but it lasts a really long time. So I just like to fold it up and mark it with the color and the job it was for. And then if I ever have to reprint that job, I have an accurate color ready to go. Now for cleaning off the photopolymer, once again, I recommend a dry rag to prevent the mineral spirits from kind of like greasing up or oiling up the plate and preventing it from printing well next time. And the plates last a really long time. If you save the backing and just re-stick them, I'll find that they can print great even years later if I want to revisit the images. Now for the inking disc and the rollers, you do need to use a little bit of mineral spirits or some kind of other cleaner. So my rags, you can see I reuse them over and over again because they dry in between. And the key is just to kind of really pay attention and just make sure you get off all the ink from the edges of the rollers as you're kind of wiping them down. And that's it, you guys. That's a letterpress job from start to finish. So I hope this was really helpful and happy printing.